The summer sun beat down on Maplewood Lane, a quiet neighborhood that always seemed a little too perfect for its own good. Neatly trimmed hedges lined each property, flower beds were carefully arranged to look more like magazine covers than gardens, and the sidewalks were spotless as if even the wind had been told to keep away. James never thought his lawn, of all things, would put him at odds with the HOA. He was a retired schoolteacher, someone who had always believed in doing things right, work hard, treat people fairly, and take pride in what you own. After his wife passed away, the small home they bought together became his sanctuary, and taking care of the yard gave him peace. He would spend mornings watering, afternoons pulling weeds, and evenings sitting on his porch with a cup of tea, looking at the vibrant green grass that reminded him of the life he had built. It wasn't just grass. To him, it was a memory, a piece of his heart, and a connection to her. One Tuesday morning, as James was adjusting his sprinklers, a black SUV pulled up in front of his home. Out stepped the HOA's property compliance officer, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on his nose like a badge of authority. His name was Mr. Kendall, but most neighbors whispered about him behind closed doors, calling him the HOA hawk because of how he circled the neighborhood, searching for infractions. James gave him a polite wave, expecting nothing more than a neighborly nod. Instead, Kendall marched across the lawn as if he owned it, his shiny shoes pressing down on the very grass James cared for so much. "Mr. Whitaker," Kendall began in a tone that carried no warmth, "we've received multiple complaints about your lawn." James looked around, confused. His lawn was spotless, healthier than most on the street. He asked, "Complaints? About what exactly?" Kendall adjusted his sunglasses and spoke as though he was reading from a script. "Your grass, sir. It's too green. It doesn't match the uniform look of the community. It's drawing unnecessary attention." James thought he had misheard. Too green? Since when was having healthy grass a violation? He chuckled nervously, but Kendall remained stone-faced. "You'll be receiving a formal letter. If the situation isn't corrected, you'll face fines." That evening, James sat on his porch staring at his lawn, the same way he had done for years, but now it felt different. His sanctuary had become a target. The next morning, the letter arrived, neatly typed, full of official HOA jargon, and stamped with a warning. It stated that his lawn violated the community harmony aesthetic and demanded he reduce watering, allow natural browning, or replace sections to better blend with neighboring properties. Reading it, James felt both disbelief and anger. His neighbors had brown patches and weeds scattered in their yards, yet no one was knocking on their doors. Why was he singled out? As days turned into weeks, the HOA sent more letters. Each one carried a sharper tone, a sterner warning, and a higher threat of fines. James tried to reason with them, writing back polite letters explaining how his lawn was maintained within all rules, no banned chemicals, no excess water usage. Still, the HOA remained unmoved. Soon, neighbors began whispering. Some admired James for keeping his property so pristine, others shrugged and said, "You know how the itch is, best not to fight them." But James had lived long enough to know when something wasn't fair, and this was bullying dressed in legal paper. The tension came to a boiling point one Saturday when James stepped outside to find 3 HOA board members standing in front of his house. They weren't there to chat. They were pointing, measuring, and taking photographs as if documenting a crime scene. James approached calmly but firmly. "What exactly are you doing on my property?" he asked. One of them, a woman with an air of superiority, responded, "We're gathering evidence." "You've failed to comply, Mr. Whitaker." He clenched his fists but kept his voice steady. "Evidence? For what? For taking care of my lawn? For honoring my wife's memory?" The woman frowned but didn't answer. Instead, they snapped more photos and left without another word. That night, James couldn't sleep. He walked his lawn in the moonlight, remembering the evenings he and his wife would sit together, laughing about how neighbors spent more on lawn services while they simply nurtured theirs with love and patience. He knew then that giving up wasn't an option. He wasn't just defending grass. He was standing up for his dignity, for the principle that a person's home should never be controlled by petty rules designed to crush individuality. His fight had only begun. And if you're watching this right now, you probably feel the same way, that people deserve the right to take pride in their homes without fear of being punished for it. Stories like James's are happening everywhere, and sharing them helps more homeowners stand strong. If you believe in fairness, in standing up against unfair HOA abuse, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share it with your friends. Because together, we can make sure voices like James's are never silenced. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Every time James stepped onto his porch, he felt eyes watching him. It wasn't just his lawn anymore, it was as if he had become the neighborhood spectacle. People walking their dogs slowed down near his property, some whispering, others shaking their heads. A few even gave him supportive nods, but most were silent, afraid of drawing the HOA's attention themselves. That silence stung the most. James had spent decades teaching young people about courage, about speaking up for what's right, yet here he was, surrounded by neighbors who would rather look away. The official notices didn't stop. In fact, they grew more aggressive. The HOA demanded payment of preliminary fines, threatening legal action if he refused. James had lived long enough to know intimidation when he saw it. He had faced worse in life than a group of board members with too much power and too little compassion. But as the letters piled up, as the phone calls came in from the HOA office with sharp, rehearsed voices reminding him of his violations, the weight pressed on him. He was a widower, living alone, and sometimes the silence inside the house made the HOA's noise feel even louder. One evening, James received a letter marked Final Notice. It declared that if he did not comply, the HOA would hire a landscaping company to alter his lawn and charge him thousands of dollars for it. That letter shook him. His lawn wasn't just grass. It was where he had spread his wife's ashes beneath a maple tree, where they had planted flowers together during their last spring. The thought of strangers digging into that soil, undoing what he had so carefully preserved, brought tears to his eyes. For the first time in years, James sat at his kitchen table, head in his hands, wondering if he had the strength to keep going. But then came a knock at the door. It was his neighbor, Mrs. Collins, an elderly widow herself. She carried a plate of cookies and a gentle smile. "I heard what they are doing to you," she said softly. "I want you to know you're not alone." James invited her in, and for hours, they talked about loss, about community, about how unfair it all felt. By the time she left, James's resolve had returned. He realized that this fight wasn't just his anymore. It was for everyone who had ever been bullied into silence by people hiding behind rules. The HOA thought they could break him with threats, but instead, they had lit a fire inside him. The next morning, James walked down to the town library. He spent hours digging through the HOA's governing documents, the community's bylaws, and local property laws. What he discovered made his jaw tighten in both anger and determination. Nowhere in the HOA rules was there a clause about grass color, about 2 green lawns, or about forcing conformity of that kind. The so-called violation wasn't even real, it was an invention, a manipulation meant to pressure him into submission. James photocopied every relevant page, highlighted every line that proved his innocence, and organized them neatly into a binder. He might have been retired, but he still knew how to prepare a case like a teacher preparing for a lesson. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James stood at his porch with the binder in hand. He no longer felt like a man under attack. He felt like a man ready for battle. When the next HOA meeting rolled around, he would be there. Not as a victim, but as someone armed with truth. Still, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The HOA thrived on fear, on homeowners too tired or too scared to resist. But James wasn't built that way. He remembered the words he used to tell his students, "Stand up, even if your voice shakes. Because silence always costs more than courage." That night, sleep came easier. He dreamt of his wife smiling on their porch, the lawn stretching out before them like a green carpet of peace. In his dream, she whispered, "Don't give up, James. This is your home. Protect it." When he awoke, he felt a calm determination he hadn't felt in weeks. He brewed a strong pot of coffee, opened his binder, and prepared his statement. He would confront the board face to face, expose their lies, and make sure the truth was heard. But as fate would have it, the HOA wasn't going to wait for him to come to them. That very afternoon, he found another notice taped to his door. This time, it wasn't just a letter. It was a citation claiming he owed $3,500 in fines, payable within 30 days. The HOA wasn't bluffing anymore. They were escalating, testing how far they could push him. James read the paper carefully, then looked out over his lawn. His fists clenched, but his spirit did not break. If they want to fight, he whispered, then they've got one. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Could he really take them on alone? But then he thought of Mrs. Collins, of the neighbors who secretly admired his courage, of the countless others in different neighborhoods who had probably faced similar battles but never had the strength to resist. James knew then that this fight was bigger than him. He wasn't just standing for his lawn. He was standing for fairness, for every homeowner who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. And to everyone watching this right now, remember, when someone tries to silence you with fear, that's when your voice matters most. If you've ever stood up to unfair treatment, or if you believe in the power of truth, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends. Because together, we can shine a light on stories they want hidden, and make sure no one has to face these battles alone. The night of the HOA meeting arrived with a quiet tension that seemed to hang over the neighborhood. The community center was buzzing, homeowners filing in, some grumbling under their breath about dues, others just there to watch the latest drama unfold. James walked in with his binder tucked under his arm, his steps steady but his heart pounding. He was no stranger to standing in front of people. Years of teaching had given him that, but this was different. This wasn't a classroom. This was his home, his life, and his dignity on trial. Inside, the board members sat at a long table like judges at a tribunal. At the center was Kendall, the compliance officer, with his polished shoes and his smug expression, already rifling through a stack of papers as though preparing to dismiss James before he even spoke. The board president, a woman named Patricia, gavelled the meeting to order. Her voice carried a practiced authority, the kind that had silenced many homeowners before. Next on the agenda, she announced, Mr. James Whitaker, concerning multiple violations related to lawn maintenance. James stood, his binder pressed to his chest. He could feel eyes on him, neighbors curious, skeptical, some supportive, some indifferent. He walked to the front, placed the binder on the podium, and took a slow breath. Then he began. I've received letters. I've received fines. I've received threats. All because, according to this board, my grass is too green. A ripple of laughter and disbelief ran through the room, quickly hushed by Patricia's gavel. But James pressed on. Tonight, I want to make one thing very clear. There is no rule, none, in the HOA's bylaws that dictates the color or vibrancy of grass. I've read them, front to back. And I've brought the proof. He opened the binder, flipping to highlighted pages, reading aloud passages that outlined lawn care requirements. Nowhere did it mention uniform appearance, nowhere did it mandate conformity in grass color. The only requirement, James said firmly, is that lawns must be maintained, free of weeds, and not neglected. My lawn meets and exceeds those standards. You can't invent rules as you go simply because you don't like how something looks. Kendall shifted uncomfortably, his smugness faltering for the first time. Patricia interjected, Mr. Whitaker, the board reserves the right to enforce community harmony standards. James looked her in the eye and replied, then show me where it says that in writing. Show me the clause, the paragraph, the sentence. Because harmony is not defined by intimidation, it's defined by fairness. The room grew quiet. Homeowners leaned forward, some nodding subtly, others whispering. James continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. This lawn is more than just grass. It's my peace. It's the place where I sit every evening remembering my late wife. It's where we planted flowers together. It's where she asked me to take care of this home, long after she was gone. And I'll be damned if anyone tells me that honoring her memory is against the rules. His voice cracked slightly, and in that moment, the emotion pierced the room. Even those who had come indifferent now felt the weight of his words. Patricia cleared her throat, visibly uncomfortable. That may be so, but fines have already been issued. The board's decision. Before she could finish, James slammed the binder shut. No. You don't get to make decisions based on feelings of power. The law is clear, and I will fight this. If you think you can bully me into paying fines I don't owe, then I'll see you in court. And when I do, every single one of my neighbors will know the truth about how this board operates." A low murmur of approval spread through the room. People who had never dared speak against the HOA were now emboldened by James's defiance. Kendall, red-faced, leaned into his microphone. "Mr. Whitaker, you're out of line." James turned to him and said calmly, "No, sir. For the first time in a long time, I'm right where I need to be." Patricia banged the gavel again, declaring the matter unresolved and moving on to the next agenda item. But the damage was done. The room buzzed with energy, homeowners whispering, shaking James's hand as he returned to his seat. For the first time, the board's control had cracked. And everyone saw it. When James left the meeting, he stepped into the cool night air with his head high. He knew the fight wasn't over, they wouldn't back down easily. But something had shifted. He was no longer standing alone. People had seen the injustice for themselves, and whispers of support were turning into voices of courage. A few neighbors even followed him to his car, patting his shoulder, thanking him for saying what they'd always been too afraid to say. "You're not just fighting for yourself," one man said. "You're fighting for all of us." At home, James sat on his porch, the same spot where the trouble had begun. He looked at his lawn, glowing softly under the porch light, and smiled faintly. It wasn't just about the grass anymore. It was about principle, about standing against people who thought power gave them the right to dictate every detail of a person's life. The board might escalate. They might drag him to court. They might try to break him with more letters, more threats, more fines. But James had found his strength again. And this time, he wouldn't be silenced. And if you're still watching, let me tell you something important. James's story isn't unique. There are homeowners across the country facing the same intimidation, the same abuse of power. If you believe people deserve the right to protect their homes, their memories, and their dignity, hit subscribe right now, like this video, and share it with your friends. Because every time we raise our voices together, we prove that no board, no HOA, and no bully can silence the truth. The week after the HOA meeting was strangely quiet, almost too quiet. James noticed fewer cars slowing in front of his house, fewer neighbors stopping to whisper near his lawn. It was as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what the board would do next. James wasn't naive. He knew people like Patricia and Kendall didn't take challenges lightly. They would come back stronger, more ruthless, determined to make an example out of him. That's what bullies did when their power was threatened, they doubled down. The first retaliation came in the form of a new letter, thick with legal jargon, delivered not by regular mail but by certified courier. It claimed that James was in violation of excessive water use, citing a vague clause about resource conservation. James laughed bitterly when he read it. He had installed a smart sprinkler system years ago, set to water just enough to keep the grass alive, no more. His water bills were lower than most on the street. This wasn't about water. It was about punishment. The second strike came a few days later, when he returned from the grocery store to find a bright orange notice staked into his yard for the entire neighborhood to see: non-compliant property. Subject to corrective action. The bold letters burned into his chest like an accusation. Cars slowed as they passed, neighbors peeking from behind curtains. James ripped the sign out of the ground, his hands shaking. The board wasn't just trying to fine him anymore. They were trying to humiliate him. That night, James sat on his porch, staring at the empty space where the sign had been. Doubt crept in again. He thought of his wife, how she used to reassure him whenever life felt overwhelming. "You're stronger than you think, James," she used to say. He whispered those words to himself now, like a prayer. "I'm stronger than they think." The next morning, Mrs. Collins appeared again, this time with a determined look. "They're trying to break you," she said firmly. "But you're not alone. People are talking. They're tired of the board too. They're just scared. If you keep standing, others will follow." Her words gave James a spark of hope. He wasn't fighting just for himself anymore. He was giving others the courage they had been too afraid to find. Still, the battle escalated. A week later, James received notice that the board had scheduled a mandatory inspection of his property. He knew what that meant. They planned to march onto his land, dig around, and document anything they could twist into another violation. He called a local lawyer, a calm, sharp man named Robert, who specialized in HOA disputes. After hearing James's story, Robert chuckled. "Too green? That's a new one. Don't worry, Mr. Whitaker. They are bluffing, and I'll make sure they regret it." For the first time in weeks, James felt like he had an ally who knew how to fight back with more than just words. The day of the inspection, James and Robert stood side by side on the porch as 3 HOA board members marched up with clipboards. Patricia, with her stiff blazer and cold smile, led the group. "We're here to conduct an inspection," she declared. Robert stepped forward before James could answer. "Not without proper legal authority, you're not. This is private property. You have no right to step beyond the sidewalk unless my client consents, which he does not." Patricia's smile faltered, but she tried to recover. "The HOA has authority over community property." Robert cut her off smoothly. "This is not community property. This is Mr. Whitaker's yard, maintained within all published rules. Unless you can show me the exact clause that allows this intrusion, I suggest you leave." The standoff was tense. Neighbors peeked from windows, watching the confrontation unfold. Patricia hissed under her breath, "You think a lawyer will save you?" Robert smiled politely. "Not just save him. Protect him. And if you keep this up, we'll see you in front of a judge who won't be amused by your made-up rules." For the first time, the board retreated. They turned and walked away, their authority shaken in front of everyone. That night, James received phone calls from neighbors who had witnessed it. Some thanked him, some asked about Robert, and one even confessed, "I've been fined 3 times for silly things, but I never fought back. Watching you stand up today, it gave me courage." James realized then that his fight had already grown larger than himself. He was becoming a symbol, whether he wanted it or not. But the HOA wasn't finished. They launched a smear campaign. Rumors began spreading, whispers that James was wasting water during a drought, that he was difficult, that he refused to cooperate with community standards. At first, James tried to ignore it. But when a neighbor he had known for years avoided eye contact, he felt the sting. The board wanted to isolate him, to turn his community against him. Instead of shrinking, James did something unexpected. He invited neighbors over for coffee. He opened his porch, served pie, and let people see the truth for themselves. They saw his water bills, his binder of rules, his calm explanations. Slowly, the whispers began to change. The board's lies were unraveling. And James realized something powerful: sunlight was the best disinfectant. The more people saw the truth, the weaker the board's grip became. Yet, as James sat on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint his lawn gold, he knew the biggest battle was still ahead. The board had threatened court action before, and after being humiliated twice, they would be desperate. He tightened his grip on his tea mug and whispered, "Let them come." Because now, he wasn't just defending grass. He was defending memory, dignity, and the right of every homeowner to live without fear of being crushed by petty power. And to everyone watching right now, sometimes life will test you with battles you never expected. But when you stand your ground, you give others permission to do the same. If you believe in courage, in truth, and in never letting bullies win, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends. Because together, we can turn even the smallest fights into victories that matter. The official notice arrived in a stiff white envelope with bold black lettering, "Notice of Legal Action." The HOA had filed a lawsuit against James. They were demanding immediate payment of accumulated fines, plus legal fees, claiming that his non-compliance had disrupted community harmony. James held the paper in his trembling hands, the weight of it heavy on his chest. This was their last card, their ultimate weapon. They were dragging him into court, hoping the sheer pressure and cost would force him to surrender. But James didn't fold. He called Robert, his lawyer, who simply said, "Good. Let's take this fight where it belongs. They've overplayed their hand, and now we'll expose them." For the first time since the battle began, James felt a flicker of excitement. The court wasn't the HOA's playground. It was neutral ground, where facts mattered more than intimidation. The day of the trial dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of morning that mirrored James's nervous heart. He put on his best suit, one he hadn't worn since his wife's funeral, and stood before the mirror. "This is for you," he whispered, picturing her gentle smile. Then he straightened his tie and headed out. At the courthouse, the HOA board members huddled together, stiff and self-important, with Kendall shuffling papers like a man rehearsing a play. Patricia's cold eyes locked on James as if she had already won. But James only nodded politely. He wasn't afraid anymore. Inside the courtroom, the judge, a stern woman with silver hair, took her seat. The HOA's attorney began first, painting James as a difficult, uncooperative homeowner who had repeatedly refused to follow rules designed to preserve community harmony. The lawyer gestured dramatically toward photos of James's lawn. "As you can see, Your Honor, the vibrancy and unnatural color of Mr. Whitaker's grass disrupts the aesthetic balance of the neighborhood. He has been warned multiple times and continues to defy the association's authority." A few chuckles escaped from the gallery. Neighbors who had come to watch found the argument absurd. Then it was Robert's turn. He stood calmly, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Your Honor, what you've just heard is not law. It's opinion, dressed up as authority. My client has followed every published rule in the HOA bylaws. And here," he lifted James's binder, thick with highlighted sections, "is the proof." He flipped to page after page, reading aloud the requirements for lawn care: mow regularly, prevent weeds, avoid hazards. Nowhere, Your Honor, does it mention grass color. Nowhere does it authorize fines for being too green. The judge raised an eyebrow, glancing at Patricia. "Counsel, is this true?" The HOA lawyer stammered, flipping through papers. "Well, Your Honor, the board has discretion to interpret." The judge cut him off. "Interpretation is not the same as legislation. If it's not written, it's not enforceable." Patricia shifted uncomfortably, her composure slipping. Then Robert turned to the heart of the matter. He placed a photo of James's lawn on the table. "Your Honor, this isn't about grass. This is about control. This is about an HOA board exceeding its authority to bully a homeowner who dared to take pride in his property. My client isn't neglectful. He isn't disruptive. He's guilty only of caring too much. And that should never be punished." The courtroom grew quiet. James sat there, hands folded, his heart pounding. Then, as if moved by something deeper, Robert added softly, "Mr. Whitaker's wife passed away several years ago. That lawn is more than turf, it's a living memory of her. Every flower, every blade of grass, is part of how he honors her. And this board wants to destroy that because it's too green. Tell me, Your Honor, is that justice?" The judge's eyes softened. She leaned back in her chair, silence filling the room. Finally, she spoke. "I've seen many HOA disputes, but this is one of the most absurd. The board has overreached its authority. The fines are hereby nullified. Furthermore, the HOA is ordered to reimburse Mr. Whitaker for any legal expenses incurred." Patricia's face went pale. Kendall's jaw dropped. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some neighbors smiling, some even clapping before the bailiff hushed them. James felt his chest loosen for the first time in months. He had won. Not just for himself, but for every homeowner who had ever been told to bow down to unfair rules. He stood, shook Robert's hand firmly, and whispered, "Thank you." Robert smiled. "No, thank you. You had the courage to stand up when most wouldn't." As James walked out of the courthouse, neighbors followed. Mrs. Collins was there, tears in her eyes, hugging him tightly. Others patted his back, congratulated him, even asked how they too could challenge unfair fines. James realized he had become something he never expected, a symbol of resistance, of dignity, of hope. That night, sitting once again on his porch, James looked out over his lawn. The grass glowed in the moonlight, green and alive, untouched by the HOA's threats. He raised his glass of iced tea to the stars and whispered to his wife, "We did it." And if you're still here, listening to this story, remember this: sometimes the battles you never wanted end up being the ones that define you. James stood up for his grass, but more importantly, he stood up for his freedom. If you believe in fairness, in standing tall against abuse of power, subscribe right now, like this video, and share it with your friends. Because stories like James's remind us all, when you refuse to bend, you teach others to stand. The victory in court should have been the end of it, but for James, it was only the beginning of something greater. In the days that followed, word of his win spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors who had once avoided him now crossed the street to shake his hand. Cars slowed in front of his house not to gawk in judgment, but to offer honks of support and friendly waves. For the first time since the battle began, Maplewood Lane felt like a community again, not a place ruled by fear, but a place where people realized they could have a voice. James noticed the shift almost immediately. Mrs. Collins started planting roses along her walkway without worrying if the HOA would complain about the color. The Petersons down the block repainted their shutters a shade of blue they had always loved but never dared to choose. And the Martins finally put out the garden gnome their grandchildren had given them years ago, laughing as they set it by their flower bed. Little by little, people began reclaiming their homes, adding touches of individuality that made the neighborhood come alive. The board, humiliated by their courtroom defeat, retreated into silence. Patricia resigned quietly a few weeks later, citing personal reasons. Kendall was rarely seen again, his daily patrols replaced by a new compliance officer who, perhaps wisely, took a much softer approach. The iron grip of the HOA had loosened, and James's courage had been the key that broke it. Yet, for James, the true reward wasn't the court ruling or the sudden admiration of his neighbors. It was the peace he felt when he sat on his porch again, sipping tea, watching the lawn sway in the breeze. He realized he no longer felt the heavy knot of dread in his chest. The space that had once been filled with fear was now filled with something else, freedom. He thought of his wife, how she always told him to take care of their home, to treat it with love, and he smiled softly. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "I kept it safe." One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of orange and gold, a group of neighbors gathered on his porch. They brought food, lawn chairs, and laughter. It wasn't planned, it just happened. Someone suggested they start a community night, a monthly gathering where people could share stories, ideas, and a sense of togetherness outside of HOA meetings. James found himself at the center of it, not as a leader, but as a neighbor who had shown everyone what was possible. As the group laughed and chatted, Mrs. Collins leaned over and said, "You know, James, you've done more for this neighborhood than any board ever did. You reminded us that this is our home, not theirs." Her words touched him deeply. He realized then that his battle wasn't just about fighting back. It was about restoring something the HOA had quietly stolen over the years, a sense of belonging, of ownership, of pride that wasn't dictated by fear. Weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood blossomed in ways James had never imagined. Lawns were still neat, houses still cared for, but they weren't clones of one another anymore. They reflected the people who lived inside them, different, unique, and full of character. What once felt like a rulebook-driven showroom now felt like a community again. One Saturday morning, James was kneeling by the maple tree in his yard, gently pruning the flowers planted beneath it. A young couple walking by stopped and smiled. "Your lawn is beautiful," the woman said. "We just moved here, and everyone told us about you. You're kind of a legend." James chuckled, brushing the dirt from his hands. "A legend, hey? All I did was refuse to let them bully me." The young man shook his head. "No, you reminded everyone that this is their home. That matters." That night, James sat on his porch under the stars, listening to the quiet hum of crickets. He thought back to the beginning, when the board first told him his grass was too green. It seemed laughable now, but he knew it had been serious then. Serious enough to break someone else. Serious enough to silence a neighbor who didn't have the fight in them. He realized just how close he had come to giving up, and how glad he was that he hadn't. He lifted his glass of tea toward the sky, toward the memory of his wife, and whispered, "We did it, love. We protected our home. And we gave others the courage to protect theirs too." And to everyone watching this right now, remember James's story. It wasn't about grass. It was about standing tall when life tries to push you down. It was about courage, about dignity, about the simple truth that home should be where your heart is, not where someone else's rules try to cage it. If you believe in that, If you've ever had to fight for something that mattered to you, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share it with your friends. Because together, we can remind the world, no one has the right to take away the pride you have in your own home. The night grew still, the stars shining brighter above him. James leaned back in his chair, the smell of fresh grass drifting through the air, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. True, lasting peace. The kind that comes when you know you've done the right thing. The kind that comes when you've stood your ground, and won.